My name is Ruby Harris, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe it's time for us to stop carrying everyone else and start protecting our peace. I found out my daughter sold my church choir dress online for quick cash, and instead of raising my voice, I reclaimed the car. At first, it felt like a small, private theft, an empty hanger, a missing seam that used to rest against my collarbone. But the way she laughed about it on social media, that was the proof it wasn't a mistake. That laugh showed me every favor I had ever done had been taken for granted. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to, I come from a long line of women who made a home into a harbor. My mother cut school to help our house run. My Aunt Loretta sang alto in the choir and fed 3 kids from the same pot. And I learned early on that if you can do it, you must. That's how I became Ruby Harris, deaconess, choir soprano, and the woman everybody asked at 6 a.m. to bring greens for the church potluck. Sunday wardrobe was its own ministry. The suit in question was custom, hand-stitched by Mrs. Delaney, the seamstress who understands how fabric holds your back up when your knees don't want to. For years I covered bills so Jasmine could breathe. Rent when her job fell through, car insurance when she forgot to pay, the security deposit for that apartment that looked cute in pictures but smelled like trouble. I didn't keep a strict ledger. I kept a calendar in my head and told myself I was helping my child stand on her feet. I baked sweet potato pies every Thanksgiving for a family that always showed up on time. I prayed for her late-night choices while ironing collars, convinced that prayer would cure what money couldn't. The first time I protested, a little, a whisper, she sighed like I had interrupted her. "Ma, why you trippin'? I'll pay you back," Jasmine said when I asked about small loans. I believed the words because I wanted them to be true. I believed them so much I co-signed on a few things I shouldn't have, assuming love would protect us from interest. When Pastor Henry gave his sermon about sacrifice, I nodded and thought of the nights I stayed up worrying, the time I missed my granddaughter's recital to drive Jasmine downtown to interview for a job she didn't show up for. Then, one quiet Tuesday night after choir practice, Loretta slid a phone across the pew. "Ruby, I don't want to pry, but your girl's on Insta flexing that vintage suit like she found it at a thrift store." I felt the phone cool in my hand, the photo of Jasmine laughing with 2 women on a beach, the suit on a chair behind her, my suit. I had sewn myself into so many people's lives, I had forgotten to stitch a seam for myself. That image, small and brutal, was the first new thing that night, the discovery that what I treasured had been sold, and the proof was laughing at me from a screen. A week later, I counted up the dinners I'd cooked, the bailouts, the months I covered the water bill while Jasmine figured things out. I found, tucked behind old hymnals, receipts with my name signed as guarantor, car registration paperwork that still listed me as the owner of a vehicle I never drove but paid for insurance on. The discovery of ownership is a quiet, practical kind of power. It isn't flashy, but it sits in your lap like a coin you can use. That legal slip was the hinge for what came next. As Sundays passed and people nodded at the choir loft, I started to feel the weight shift from martyr to ledger. My heart still thrummed when I sang, but there was an undercurrent, a new math forming, 1 part grace, 1 part limits. I kept my voice steady. Nobody needed to know I was counting, but I was counting. The second new thing in that slow unravel, I began to catalog every kindness, not in anger, but in preparation. I had to decide if I wanted to be worn out like old cloth or folded up and kept for something softer. The next Sunday, Jasmine came to church wearing confidence like lipstick. She smiled at me like nothing had happened and kissed my cheek as if my presence was her blessing. After service, she checked her phone in the foyer and laughed out loud. "Ma, guess who just made a quick little flip? Miami called my name," she announced to anyone within hearing range. The sound cut through the potluck line. People pretended not to listen, but Pastor Henry caught my eye with a look that said, "You deserve better." I asked about the suit in the privacy of my kitchen later, because confrontation in front of the ladies would be spectacle, and I didn't want spectacle. "It was just sitting," Jasmine said. She used the phrase like a talisman. "You know how much stuff you got. I didn't see why you needed it to sit." Her voice was casual. Her entitlement wore brunch heels. She flipped through my recipe book like nothing had been taken. The third new thing. She didn't hide it. She admitted it and was unapologetic. "Jazz, that suit," I started, but she cut me off. "Ma, you always overdo. I was going to make something of it. You think I want to be stuck here forever?" She leaned against my counter, tracing an imaginary ring on a finger I never had. There was a bravado in her that hid insecurity, and it made her dangerous because she believed she had a right to my overflow. Her words landed like small stones in a pond I had thought still. When I called her out on social media bragging, because a woman of my age knows how to find what's being said about her, she waved it off. "People post stuff. It's just clicks." Later that night, I overheard her on the phone telling a friend, "Mama'll understand. She always understands." That phrase was the cutting thing. She had reduced a lifetime of care into an expectation. The hurt was quiet, but the next new event that shook me was the realization she thought I owed her my dignity. A few days later, a man from an online vintage boutique messaged me. "Is Ruby Harris missing a designer floral suit?" he asked. He'd seen the listing and recognized Mrs. Delaney's work from neighborhood posts. My stomach dropped. He sent photos, the suit's braid, the tiny worn spot under the arm where I mended with invisible thread. He wanted to know if it was reported stolen. I felt something inside close up the way a door does when locked from the outside. The betrayal measured itself in pixels, comments, and a laughing selfie from Miami. That night, Jasmine came home with a sunburn and a little bag of trinkets. "It was a weekend, Ma," she said, shrugging like it had been a simple errand. I had a choice then. Call her out on the porch where neighbors would listen, or do something that would stop the pattern without shouting. My chest tightened, and the next new thing unfurled. I found myself looking at the little slip of paper in my purse that showed the car in the driveway was still registered to me. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. I sat down at the kitchen table, set out the car papers, and listened to the radio humming like nothing was wrong. The breaking point didn't roar. It was a soft, cold clarity that tastes like lemons. I would not let my life be a free service anymore. The last event in this act pushed me to the edge. I made a plan I could live with. That plan started with the photos. I pulled out an old album from the drawer, wedding pictures, my mother's hands kneading dough, Jasmine as a toddler in a yellow dress. I traced a line from those photos to the empty hangar to the Miami video. The memories were not excuses. They were reasons I refused to become a doormat. I took a breath and remembered the old legal fact I'd kept in a shoebox, the car title, in my name. That realization felt criminal and merciful at the same time. If Jasmine thought my love was endless credit, I would balance the ledger. The very next morning I woke early, packed a small bag, and put on sensible shoes. I didn't tell Jasmine where I was going. I drove her car, the one she assumed she owned in practice, down to the dealership where a man named Eddie used to make small talk about the tigers and my roses. I kept my voice level when they asked for paperwork. "It's registered in my name," I said. His pen scratched. The fourth new event. I sold the car. It was a practical sale, not a theft. There were forms, signatures, and a check that felt heavier than the car itself. I used some of the money to cover debts Jasmine had run up in my name and to stop the auto payments I had foolishly left active for her convenience. I walked into the bank like a woman with a quiet mission, closed accounts, and filed for cancellation of the insurance policy that had been in my name. Each small signature felt like a stitch being cut free. I did not watch Jasmine flail. Instead, I locked a drawer and put the spare keys on top where she couldn't reach them. When I returned home that afternoon, I left the house quietly. The driveway was the same. The bird feeders still swung. I sat at the church bench and listened to choir practice through the stained glass windows, feeling both guilty and liberated. I had not yelled or stomped. I had not turned my hurt into a sermon. The decision was merciful in its silence. It was the kind of revenge that doesn't shout. That night's new event was the text I sent. Car sold, insurance canceled. No emoji, no explanation. When Jasmine stormed in, she expected the keys in the bowl and my slow apology. She found silence instead. "Where my car at?" she demanded, voice sharp as a lost earring. I poured tea and set it down in front of her. "It's gone," I said. She tried to laugh it off, but the fifth event landed. A notice slid under the door from the insurance company, a cold printed line stating cancellation for non-payment because I had closed the linked account. Her face went slack. She had assumed I would salvage it all, again. The look she gave me was not of defeat, but of astonished betrayal, as if I had swapped her birthright for bread. I packed up my choir sheet music that night, not in fury, but with a calm I had never afforded myself. I chose softness, a new suit, thoughtfully purchased with money I kept for me, made by Mrs. Delaney herself, and a life with fewer unpaid obligations. The final image of the act is simple. I hung fresh fabric back in the closet, closed the door, and sat on the porch to watch the sunset, letting the quiet be my companion. By the next morning, without my automatic cushions, the little cracks Jasmine had papered over began widening. Her landlord called about a missed rent that week. Her card declined at the corner store because I had stopped covering her overdraft. The first domino fell. A utility company left a warning that service would be interrupted. Panic rose the way smoke does under an old roof. That morning's new event was practical and immediate. She could not get to work because her ride had been the car I sold. She started with small apologies and escalated quickly to accusations. "You always did this. You hold everything over me." She pressed her phone to her ear like a talisman, calling friends who had been complicit by silence. One by one, they offered weak sympathies and none of the cash they knew how to pull from their pockets for brunch. A friend who had bought a ticket to Miami refunded Jasmine after seeing the Instagram post where Jasmine boasted about selling something she didn't own. The fallout was quieter than a hurricane and just as destructive. Money dried up in ways that felt inevitable. A debt collector began calling, reference numbers rattling like dice. Jasmine's boss, who monitored employee social channels, saw the posts boasting about the weekend and the designer find, and questioned Jasmine about honesty and responsibility. The sixth new event shocked me the most. She lost the job interview she had been holding like a promise to me. Her future employer didn't appreciate making money off family property. That's not poetic justice, that's consequence. Neighbors who had quietly watched also turned their faces. The couple across the street, who had borrowed sugar 3 times and accepted my casserole without ever returning an empty dish, now walked past my garden without a glance. Jasmine found herself walking to the bus stop in the rain because she had no money for an Uber. The image of her, wet hair clinging to her neck and a plastic umbrella limp in one hand, was not satisfying to me. It was a solemn accounting. The twist came when Mrs. Delaney, the seamstress, returned my suit to the family after someone recognized it as a unique piece and asked questions. She sent a message with a single photo of the suit folded in tissue paper. The dress was back where it belonged. The thing of value had been reclaimed by the one who had cared enough to keep track. But consequences kept unfolding. Without the car to attend appointments, Jasmine missed a meeting that would have allowed her to consolidate a debt. Without the suit, her social currency evaporated among those who measure worth in tagged posts. The weight of reality pressed down. I watched all this unfold from the kitchen window, not with glee, but with a quiet observation. I had done what I needed to do. The world righted slowly, and it did so without my hand reaching out to steady it. Then an unexpected turn happened. A man who had financed Jasmine's trip reached out asking for the suit back, threatening to report the sale as fraud. That sent Jasmine spiraling. The quick cash she had boasted about was suddenly entangled in online disputes and refund claims. People she had paraded with distanced themselves. The 7th event, the unraveling of the Miami weekend, made her panic outwardly. She started begging, but by then I had already packed the list of accounts I'd closed. When she finally came back to the house with wet shoes and an apology that started with, "Ma, I'm sorry," I set down my cup of coffee, feeling nothing theatrical. She knelt by the table and reached for my hand, voice small. "Please, Ruby, I'll make it right. I can get a job, I can." Her words fluttered like moths. I let her finish, then I answered as if I were reading from scripture, not to shame, but to end the ledger. "Bless your heart, but I'm done," I said. No sermon, no dramatic unmasking, just a sentence that closed the door. Readers of my story might expect a cinematic confrontation, a scene where I shout and the neighbors come running. That never happened. She begged, offered to return the money, asked to use the car just this once. I gave her none of it. I didn't raise my voice. I had stopped being an ATM, a chauffeur, and a safety net. What I became was a woman who trusted her own quiet. The 8th event, she asked for forgiveness, and I refused with grace. In the days that followed, she tried softer approaches. She cooked dinner and left it on the stoop. She sent texts at odd hours. She tried to charm the choir ladies into lobbying for her return to easy living. They, bless them, chose not to be complicit. The pastor gave a sermon on accountability that made no mention of me, but his words settled like dust. Stewardship matters. I showed up to choir, to the front row I had always occupied, and opened my new hymn book. The custom suit fit like an apology I gave myself. Healing came in small, ordinary moments. I mended a pair of my husband's old cufflinks and placed them on the table. I pruned roses in my garden and tied back branches that had grown wild. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee at dawn and watched the sun lift over Detroit, lighting the rusted rooftops with gold. The ninth and final event that closed my story was not dramatic. Simply me, humming under my breath, opening the door to the closet and seeing the suit, returned, cared for, a piece of my history, folded neatly. I closed the closet door and went to sit in the front row of the choir loft the next Sunday. Jasmine came to the service late, breathless, shoulders hunched. She took a seat in the back, eyes darting. When the choir rose, I sang. My voice slid through the church like water through reeds. I felt neither triumph nor vengeance, only a soft, steady peace settled in my chest. After the last hymn, people came up to offer condolences or compliments, and I received them with the same calm. I did not rub her nose in the ruin. I sat with dignity and let life move forward. 2 months later, the driveway was empty most mornings. I kept a small bowl by the door for the keys I actually used. On a weekday afternoon, I brewed tea, opened an old hymnal, and began writing notes, recipes I wanted to teach my granddaughter. A note to Mrs. Delaney asking if she had a new scrap of fabric. My hands were busy with small, meaningful tasks. I watered the roses, blessed the soil with my palms, and the petals trembled in the breeze like soft applause. I do not tell this story to make anyone feel small. I tell it because sometimes the softest actions are the most decisive. The last image is simple. My hands wrapped around a warm mug, the light of late afternoon painting my porch rail gold, the empty driveway tucked into the quiet like a punctuation mark. I closed the closet and walked back to the porch, sat down, and lifted my song.